Welcome to the Team Jive podcast. Here we talk about all things business culture and teamwork, speaking to managers and directors from all walks of life. Each episode, we dive into the tools and success strategies of top performing professions through a series of thought-provoking questions. Now, here's your host, Abdi Galid, a serial entrepreneur, a Norwegian track champion, and the founder of the Team Connectedness platform, MPETA.
Welcome everyone to the Team Jive podcast. I'm your host, Abdi Galid. And today's guest is a global thought leader in equity and inclusion with a wealth of expertise in talent acquisition and management. Please join me in welcoming Kumari Williams to the podcast. As the global head of programs and operations for belonging and diversity at Workday, Kumari brings team members from all walks of life together in a tight-knit, cross-border organizational culture. Her decorated career encompasses nearly 2 decades of HR expertise throughout multiple industries. It's great to have you with us today, Kumari.
Thank you, Abdi, for the invite. I appreciate it.
Definitely. So let's get into it. I have a few questions I would like to ask you, and our audience are wondering as well. So the first thing is, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. So I am, in fact, newer to Workday. I joined the Workday team about 1.5 years ago. Yep. Prior to that, I had spent several years in talent acquisition. So I was at an organization called Harman International. I was there for, I believe, roughly 5 years and started out leading their talent acquisition team globally, and then made the brave step into DEI proper for about 1 year at Harman, and then moved over to the DEI team here, a diversity and belonging team here at Workday. So I am excited to be here and to talk more about some of the stuff we have slated to discuss.
Awesome. So one of the things that I like to ask every guest here is to bring us back a little bit. Okay. How do you get where you are today? And we'd love to just hear a couple of things or three important events or decisions that got you where you are today.
You know, I would say when I look back on my career, there were a couple moments that I didn't realize were kind of setups for the next moment. Yeah. One of those being when I took the job at Quicken Loans. So my first job out of college, I was doing campus recruiting. So traveling all throughout the US, hitting all of the college campuses, focused on just really trying to find early career talent for the company that I was with at that time. Yeah. And then got a call about an opportunity working for Quicken Loans, which is now, I think, Rocket Mortgage or Rocket Companies. Yeah. And so at the time I was newer to obviously working full time, but and wanted to really stay where I was, right, and get my legs underneath me. I was only there for about 1.5 years. And I felt like that old mindset of staying somewhere for a really long time and getting deep roots was the best way to go, especially right out of college. Yeah. But I did take a leap and decided to move over to Quicken. And I will tell you that was probably one of the best decisions that I could have ever made. It was an extremely tough environment, but I felt like it absolutely prepared me for all of my future jobs and future career moves because of the discipline and the rigor that it taught me early in my career. So that's one of the ones that I think absolutely set me up for success later in life, and didn't realize how much so it was just really good training ground for building really good habits when it comes to just how to be successful in corporate America. That environment taught me that. I would say the next really important move for me was moving from, I was working as a project manager at a company called CareTech. Mm-hmm. And that role, I realized looking back, of course, was the setup for me getting out of HR and then back into recruiting. Yeah. So I had gone into several HR business partner roles and then moved into this HR project manager role and got a call about RPO. And at the time, I had no idea what RPO was. I was really versed in recruiting, but was not familiar with what full-on recruiting process outsourcing was. And so I got in that call, took the call, took the job. And again, it was another one of those scenarios where I felt like I wasn't at that company in that role for long enough. Yeah. And then got a call about a new thing, and was really difficult for me to make the leap, but I did it. And it subsequently set me up for just being able to learn some new skills, get in a different environment. Again, moving into a really challenging environment. I find that throughout my career, the more challenging the environment is, honestly, the longer I stay, and probably I actually end up thriving in the more complex, challenging, harder to figure out environments and roles. So that role was a good setup for my first director level promotion. And that obviously has kind of been the setup for the balance of my career. But in going into RPO, making that decision and then being promoted to a director was kind of I would say those are the three big moments that have helped to set the course for the rest of my career.
That's incredible. So I just wonder, the first one, how, like, was there a drive in you? Like, what made you say, because when I talked to a lot of people, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, it's all about securing that job and staying there as long as
Yeah.
possible, right? But then having that, what should I call it, entrepreneurial mindset or that go-getter mindset, what made you think that you should not follow the path of everybody else and
Yeah.
just jump? Like, was that a drive in you? Is there a gut feeling? What was it? External, like family, or what was that?
Yeah. I will say this. I think I've always been a person that's been okay with betting on myself, right? Like I feel like given an opportunity, I
Mm,
can kind of figure it out and make it work. And I'm not afraid to take a leap, even if it doesn't necessarily feel or look logical.
yeah.
I'm usually okay with kind of my career taking different winding roads sometimes or different paths. And I'm strong enough in and confident enough to know that I can figure most things out. Given some reasonable resources, I can kind of figure some stuff out. I would say I was in a program called Inroads all throughout college, and
Yeah.
that for sure set me up for just how I started to think about my career and the importance of being intentional about your career and knowing where you want to go
Yeah.
and not being afraid to make the moves when you need to make them. So that I would attribute a lot of just my professional, I would say, rigor or discipline from the Inroads program that's still around today. It's a little different, I believe, than when I went through it, but it was I had my first internship even before I went away to my freshman year of college. I was interning for Kelly Services and spent several years interning for them over the summers,
Yeah.
and um, and graduated from the program. So I did 5 internships before even being done with college. So
Oh, wow. So you built your confidence, you built your, like, the trust in yourself, and then you took a leap of faith, and
yeah.
that's why you're where you are today. I'd like to jump on something very near me because that's what I work on almost day-to-day basis, and that's well-being and Workday. You guys are known for a lot of different things, but well-being is also one of them. So what do you think are some of the best ways that leaders in this new way of working or the modern workplace can improve on when it comes to well-being in their team members and creating that increased total well-being across the whole organization? How do you think we can do that, or what is
You
your
know,
advice?
Yeah, I would say it's a two-way street, right? So there is the leader having to absolutely make safe spaces on their teams for people to open up. So you have to create an environment, a culture of well-being and
Yeah.
wellness. It's not just, hey, we're going to run a couple programs and think that this is going to be enough. When I
Mm,
think of actually doing it right, it has to be into the fiber of the organization. So as a leader, I have to create space, just like we do with diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's the same thing with me caring about the total well-being of my employees. So I would say as a first step, it really needs to come from that leader creating an environment where they actually do genuinely care about the total person and not just the person's output. Because the
yeah.
truth is, we can all get to good output, but how sustainable that output is what we as leaders need to be extremely careful about and thoughtful about. Because if you have people that are, as we would say, like kind of burning the candle on both ends, it is not sustainable. Certainly, if they don't hit the wall with you, they're going to hit the wall in their next role with their next employer, their next leader. So actually taking a step back to create an environment where our employees can be transparent about how they're feeling is the first step. I would say on the other side of that, it is the responsibility also of us as employees to be able to share transparently with our leaders what our boundaries are, and also be able to share where they're at as far as how they're feeling in the present, right? So most of us have indicators before we hit that wall. There are signs, there are symptoms, there are symptoms of the burnout before you actually hit the wall. And so by the time you hit it, it's far too late. And trying to recover at that point is very challenging. So it is important for us to take some of our power back and say, how do I listen to my body? How do I then take these signals that my body, is giving me, and then communicate that to my leaders so that I can be a whole person, not just be considered for the output that I'm delivering for the individual.
But it could also sound a little bit risky, right?
For sure. It's not easy.
I'm an employee, and how do you create that environment or that culture where you actually are able to speak up and don't get any negativity back? Or say, for example, you're my boss and I'm telling you, hey, I feel like burned out. I'm doing too many tasks. I'm sitting in the desk for maybe 12, 13 hours a day, but I also have family things that I need to do, but I can't do. There's a lot of stuff. And how do you create that environment where it's okay to actually talk about that? And your leader is a leader, and it's not a person who's just thinking of the output. Go ahead, please.
So I will say, if you're having the conversation with your leader at the point where you're saying, I am burned out, you're having the conversation too late. I think that this whole topic should be handled very proactively. It is so that people don't get burned out. How do we create the conditions for wellness? Not I'm already burned out, I've already hit the wall, how do I recover? Because I don't have formal training in this. I don't have a doctorate, nothing to speak of, but I would say it's probably a little bit difficult to come back from that place of burnout, as opposed to let's put the right guardrails in place so that we don't even hit that wall. So how do we focus on wellness today? And a lot of that does start with the leader being aware and self-aware enough to say, I have an employee that's doing above and beyond what is expected from a sustainability standpoint, right? Like, there is what they need to deliver, and there's far above and beyond. They're working hours that are ridiculous. They're delivering at all costs. They are outpacing everyone around them for no reason other than to just deliver and to excel. And while the perfectionism is rewarded, I think, in corporate America, the downside to that is that you end up with a lot of people that are just frankly fried, and trying to coach them back after reaching that point is much more difficult than just having good boundaries to start, I would say.
The leaders in the company, you have different type of leaders. Does it come from the top, the CEO and the management level and down, or how do you, because the managers, they're actually out there to create their own, they're there to create productivity and results, right? So where does it come? Where do you build that culture? Does it start from the top, or does it start from where?
I can only speak for myself, and that's where I will speak about my lived experience. I was, years ago when I first became a mom, there were certain things that were really important to me, and being able to be present for my children and also still maintain my career was important. So I had to redefine what that looked like. And in order to be able to do both and do both well at the time, I knew I had to work at the time a lot in the evenings, because there were days that I needed to step away from work a little bit early to pick up kids from daycare, to get kids settled after school, whatever it was. And there was these kind of blocks of time that maybe, 3:30 to 5, where I wasn't as productive. And I had to hop back online after the kids are in bed at 7:30 and work several hours to be able to offset that flexibility that I had in that role. That was a boundary for me. And I think what we have to do is start to empower our employees. It's not my employer's responsibility to set my boundaries, right? Like, it is as the individual, my responsibility to say what is and is not acceptable for me, my life, and for my family, and for my career. And if I'm expecting my employer to do that for me, good luck, because you're going to be waiting forever. So how do I continue to contribute in a way that's meaningful, in a way that, continues to set me up for success in my career, but do so in a way that keeps me healthy? I feel like that's my responsibility. And that's what I'm on a quest to do every day. I think I, at a point in my career, figured it out and was doing it really well. And as I go on, I'm learning that those boundaries have to continue to be reset. It isn't like you set them once and then you're done. It's a constant protecting of, these are the things that I'm going to do to ensure wellness, within me, and you have to constantly fight to keep those things up and in place.
So there's also the managers and the leaders, but there's also the employees, and employees have to figure out what is well-being to them and how would they like to be part of a culture. And I think it's much easier now than what it was before, right?
I would agree.
Now you can go to any company out there. Most of the companies are focused on wellness and well-being, making sure that employees are not burned out. They have at least some strategies in place. And as an employer, you can, like you did, try to figure out what's good for me in thriving this place. And then you can also try to figure out which company you would like to work for, and then take it from there. So it's both places now, one setting the goals.
Right.
I love that. So in that, let's talk a little bit about culture, right? And a culture of inclusivity. Your current role at Workday, and people out there are actually wondering what are some strategies you can use to create a culture of inclusivity. We talk about that. We have a lot of consultants and companies and publications that are giving you some strategies online. But what do you think, especially given the global nature of your organization?
Yeah, I would say, just to start, do you have a measure in place to even understand what the baseline of inclusivity looks like in your organization? So before you even get to strategies, how are you measuring if you have an inclusive workforce? And one of the things that Workday does really well is we are constantly focused on ensuring that we understand what our workmates are feeling and how they're feeling about certain topics. Obviously, inclusion is one of many topics that we're assessing, or dimensions that we're assessing. And so first, you've got to be able to understand, how will I know if it is or isn't? After that, obviously, when you do find that there are gaps within inclusion or belonging or equity, any dimension that you're focused on, what interventions are you going to put in place? And that may look different, Abdi, by segment. So what our Asian population may need could be very different than our Black employee or a Black female population. And so it's almost, I don't want to go with like broad strokes of what you need to create inclusion.
Yep.
All of your segments are going to have different needs. And so what you really want to do is create a team that can create and develop interventions that meet your organization, your employees, where they're at. And so if you've got some mechanisms to measure your environment and the inclusiveness of your environment, from there, it's an exercise of identifying maybe those segments that are falling short of the bar. So if the majority feels here and some segments fall below that bar, what are we going to do to ensure that there's equity across the board and inclusion across the board and belonging across the board? So it's really more so about understanding your baseline and then figuring out what the individual segments need to close the gap. Because I will tell you that while we all have very consistent needs, I would say intrinsically, to be a part of community and to feel connected and to belong and to be included, it does depend on the lens in which you're seeing it through, how that kind of shows up and what I need. And my needs may be very different because of the intersections that I sit in. So I don't want to paint a broad, these are the 5 things that you have to do to build an inclusive environment, when in fact, you may find you do all 5 of them and it gets you nowhere because you didn't dig deep enough to understand how people were really feeling. I will say doing focus groups, obviously, to get to the heart of, even after you look at your sentiment data, taking that as step 1, but then going beyond that and getting some additional data points and getting some additional color around how people feel can be extremely insightful, because it helps you put the story behind kind of what the data says. So I don't think there's a silver bullet. That's my long and drawn out way of saying that. I think you have to be very focused on meeting your populations where they're at.
So quick question. I have a couple of questions. First one,
okay.
From your point of view, what is inclusivity?
I look at inclusivity as your organization's ability to make people feel connected, make them feel like they belong, and also ensure that they are contributing to meaningful work that they are then rewarded for. So that's when I think about kind of the conditions for inclusivity. There's obviously a lot that goes into that, but it's really about am I accepted? Do I belong? And can I contribute with meaning in my environment?
Okay, great. I love that answer. So second question is, I think even though you can't give a broad, like these are the 5 strategies you need to follow in order to create a culture of inclusivity, you still gave, I feel like the most important thing, which is understanding your people, understanding your employees, right? So that's number 1, or number 2, 3, 4, 5. It could go anywhere. But so we have Workday and we have Microsoft and we have Google. We have these big, large companies that have the ability to do so and probably use a lot of resources to like create those resource groups or focus groups and different things. But if you're talking to companies with 200 employees or 3 or 4 or 500 employees, how are you able, like, how can you get that understanding? How can you create that data that you're talking about?
You know what? I think it's super simple, Abdi. It's exactly what you just said. It's talking to your people. And you don't need to hire a fancy consultant to just talk to your people. I think you do have to create the conditions for safety psychologically for people to be able to share.
Yep.
So put some thought and some effort into how do you do that? How do you ensure that they will be protected if they share? Anonymity is important, obviously, if appropriate and where appropriate. But it's really about talking to your people. And it is about understanding what they need in order to continue to thrive in the environments that they're in. And that you can do regardless of the size of your organization.
All right. So, but you can also use Pecan, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the tool that we use today.
Tell me a little bit about that, because I read a lot about it, but tell me a little bit about your firsthand experience.
Yep. So we use a tool, which is obviously Workday's platform, but Pecan, where we have drivers and sub-drivers that we're assessing constantly, actually, to understand how our workmates or our employees feel across multiple different areas. And I pay really close attention to the D&I drivers, among others, but we use Pecan, obviously, to survey our employees on a weekly basis. And then we're benchmarked across all of our other customers so we can see where we're falling within, obviously, certainly tech, but then the broader ecosystem that we also support within Pecan.
And that could help. That's a tool that can also help you with gathering a lot of data in terms of talking to your employees. That can help you gather a lot of data from the employees, as long as you're making sure there's trust there between you and the employees, and the data is not being shared with anybody else. You can use that, and you can also create different type of groups within the company. And it's not that hard when you think about it, right? Just talk to your employees, and it's not that hard.
Well, I will say this,
but it is very hard. That's what we're all talking about.
It's hard to action. It's not hard to talk to your employees. So that's the easy part. So getting in front of them, talking to them, hearing how they feel. But when you are talking to people, you do set up an expectation that you're going to action based on what they've shared. So I would say also something to consider is, do you have the resources to invest in the time and energy it takes to actually action on what comes out of those focus groups? Think about that when you go into it, because that will help you with the design of how much you take on and at what points in the journey. Because you might decide, you know what, let me make this focus group or this survey a little bit more narrow because I know I can't action on 50 things. Let me focus in on a couple areas that we know we can probably have some quick wins with or impact and have the greatest impact with.
I love it. So let's go back a little bit. You graduated from Grand Valley State University, right? And from there till now, how do you think corporate how's corporate diversity, equity, inclusion evolved throughout the years?
So I will say, when I got into, so mind you, I started doing internships the summer before my freshman year of college. So I was interning in an HR department at Kelly Services. And I remember, hearing about diversity and inclusion and getting an idea of what it really was before I even hit my coursework. Mm-hmm. And I will say, even at that point, D&I felt like it was more focused on compliance and more on kind of reporting, those types of things. There was just the EEO stuff that you just have to do every year. And obviously increasing representation was also a huge focus back kind of in the day. Now, while that's still a pretty big focus, is increasing representation and leadership for different segments, but then also balancing out representation where you see kind of imbalance, too much, of this, not enough of this. And I would say that the greatest shift that I've noticed is in the inclusion and the belonging space. That's been, to me, the notable change is that we're focused heavily on not just getting numbers to the table and kind of filling seats. Is once I hire an employee, what is their experience like? And what is the employee life cycle like? How are we treating them? How are we making them feel engaged and feel like they can contribute in a meaningful way every single day? That has been the shift over the last, 15, 20 years. You're hearing a lot more of the conversation around the intangible things that sometimes people feel like are very difficult to measure. It is super easy to see if I have a representation goal, did I hit it or not? What was harder years ago was, while I have a representation goal, how do the people that are at this organization feel about being here, and how do they feel like they're being treated? So those are some of the shifts that we've seen.
So it's can you say it's more transparent, more openness, more trust now than before, or?
I don't know. I think we're having harder conversations now when we start to talk about, again, it's not just hiring Black or brown people. It is, what does their experience look like from the point where we initially reached out to them and started recruiting them through the process to when they offboard our organization. I think there's far more effort put into that for all employees, not just your people of color. That's just more of where we've gone as a society, is that there's far more resources and energy invested in what that candidate experience and employee experience is like. And even now having teams that are focused on, whether it's the site experience or the employee experience, that's an area that's more resourced now than it was, 15, 20 years ago.
I totally agree there. I'd like to jump on another thing, which is connected to exactly what you just said there. And there's a lot of reports out there. There's a lot of reports coming out, I think, from Workforce Institute, from McKinsey, from different companies talking about employee belongingness, employee experience, and also disconnectedness, right? So employees feeling disconnected from their company, especially now that we are remote and hybrid models are part of the most of the organization's strategies. What advice would you give to a leader today whose teams report feelings of disconnectedness from their coworker, their department, or their company?
Yeah, I would start by telling people to pick up the phone. I think it's almost like old, it's like old school to just have a conversation nowadays. And it's interesting because I'll Slack someone and say, hey, can you chat? And they'll send me a Zoom. I'm like, no, I'm just thinking like good old school telephone, like just send me your number. I'm just gonna call you. And while like the Zoom is cool and you get to see people, I do think that there's something to be said that for the fact that we spend so much time over text, email, and other kind of really quick instant message type ways to communicate with people. So I would start honestly with just picking up the phone and calling people. I do it all the time. I don't know, my employees might be annoyed by it. They haven't said it, but certainly they're probably like, why is she calling me so much? But I absolutely do call, and that is my way of trying to keep connection and not just waiting until that next one-on-one with someone. If I've got a quick thing, instead of sending a Slack, I might just say, and not at all that it's more efficient in every case, but it might just be the point of picking up the phone and hearing that person's voice, as opposed to relying so heavily on Slack and email and text or whatever means of communication. Oftentimes when people are saying they're disconnected, it is because, again, we're not taking into consideration our own needs for communication. And I'm a person that's fairly just introverted by nature, so I don't have to spend a lot of time with people, especially big groups of people. But understanding as a leader what energizes my team and what takes away from the energy on my team is also, as a leader, my responsibility. So I can design communications that energize the team as opposed to, take energy out of the group. So I'm conscious of those types of things. And then when you can have those meetings, the moments that matter in person, if you can get your teams together, even if it's just a couple of times a year, try to budget for that so that people can enjoy each other in person. And it does bring the synergy that is sometimes lost when you spend too much time apart. I've been managing virtual teams since my first leadership role. I had an employee that was virtual, and so it's what we called it, or remote.
Yeah.
And it was literally my first job in leadership. I had someone that was not in the office, and it was initially a challenge. And then I realized that she ended up being literally my top performer, the person that was not in the office every day, because she was far more truthfully effective and efficient, because there wasn't the water cooler talk and all these other things. So while it created some other challenges sometimes, by and large, that scenario taught me that you can be successful not sitting in an office, and there's just a balance, right? And so at Workday, I think we're more focused on the hybrid experience, which is 50% of the time in the office, 50% of the time not in the office, and that's what is working well for our organization.
So, are your employees also calling you? Is it just that simple? If they're wondering something, can they just call you and say, "Hey, Kumar, I'm wondering do you have a question? Do you have a minute?" They can do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you created that environment, though, right? So it's actually you who created that environment of, let's not just chat and let's just not Zoom all the time. But if there's something, let's just hop on a call, and it's that simple. Don't make it very complicated and a complex problem.
Yeah, I tend to be a person I try not to be super formal. So if people need to reach out to me and connect, I want to make sure that it feels easy for them. And even in times where I might be on PTO, if it's something that's urgent, I would rather people reach out than kind of sit and stew over a topic that we can easily solve in a 2-minute phone conversation.
Yeah, I love that. I think it depends on the person, what type of people they are. But I love the fact that if you can make sure that your employees feel like they can reach you, and if you can make, like, again, right, make them feel that you belong from onboarding to offboarding, regardless where you are in that process. But if you feel like you belong, and if you feel like you have a good relationship with your coworkers and your team, then yeah, that phone call is so much easier than sending a message and just wondering, what's gonna go on. But in connection with that, we see a lot about retention. We see a lot about Great Resignation, and we see a lot about employees leaving or quiet quitting. I think that's the new thing. But there's still some companies that are really good at keeping their employees. Right. And they have some strategies, not something they developed 1 year, but have done it for a long time. Do you have any idea or any advice of what organizations, or how can they build strong teams where employees want to stay?
I think that starts with really getting crystal clear on what the employee value proposition is. Why do I even work at this organization? What does my company offer that the next organization doesn't offer? And being able to tell that story and being able to understand exactly what your value prop is to your employees, I think is really important. And your value proposition is going to differ from organization to organization. Yep. But whatever it is, be authentic and consistent and true to that. It's one thing if I join your company understanding exactly who you are, and I walk in and it's like, cool, everything they sold me is exactly what I thought it was. It's another if I join your organization and I get there and there is this other side of the culture that I didn't know I was signing up for. And so what you want to do is, as much as possible, close that gap in dissonance. Like, you want who you say you are to be really close, darn close as possible to who you really are as an organization. That should be the goal. And be able to communicate, like, if there are things that are not so great about our culture and we know we need to do better, be okay with sharing those things so that we know this is an area of opportunity for us. We're striving, right? Usually EVPs have an aspirational element to them because you're striving for this particular area, but it shouldn't be so aspirational that when I step in the doors, it feels like this is not at all what I was sold.
Yeah.
So I think about, how do you create an environment where you're retaining your people? Are you showing up as an organization the exact same way or darn close to it as you're putting out there throughout your social channels? And most organizations are very conscious of how they're being perceived in the media by employees, by investors, whomever. And so it's really important to make sure that the messages that you're it's aligned. What you're putting out there is very consistent with who you really are.
But is that easy to do though? Like, let's say we have a company that is struggling with retaining their employees. What would you give them? Like one advice that you can tell them?
I would say if you are struggling with their employees, retention is probably broad, right? Are they having attrition issues with certain segments? Let's say they're attriting more women in leadership. I would want to get into I would want to really drill down and understand what are the driving factors behind why this particular segment is attriting at higher rates than others. And so the real work comes in when you try to get underneath what is driving the attrition. And so people will tell you when you're leaving an organization, people are not generally super honest about how their experience is. Like they want to leave on a good note. They want to be politically correct. And if you give them a survey, they're going to kind of give middle of the road or whatever. They're not going to be super honest. One of the things that we started doing was for certain segments, doing exit interviews and picking up the phone and calling, in fact, and understanding, okay, you're leaving the organization. Why? Tell me a little bit more. And just drilling down because we care and we want to make the experience better. Tell me what you didn't tell me on this paper. And getting underneath what are the drivers for why you're walking out the door and why you were even open to considering another opportunity outside of our organization. That's really what you have to do. And so when I talk about picking up the phone, though it seems simple, that is absolutely an example of where we went above and beyond and said, okay, we got to figure out what's happening here. And we need to pick up the phone and actually dig deeper to understand how this population or populations, how they're feeling. So while understanding how people feels, again, seems very simple, it helps you design your interventions that are needed to solve the problems that you have.
Yeah. So again, that's a great point, right? Understand your employees, understand your employees from day one, right? How are you creating great culture from day one? In order to do that, you got to understand, like you said earlier, what type of culture do you need? What type of employees do you have? What type of segments of employees do you have? And that again can lead you to understand what type of employees are leaving, and
right.
keep gathering that data, like you said, from onboarding all the way to offboarding, and you understand more of what type of people you would like to keep. Just last question. What are the tools or methods that you use to facilitate a more cohesive team? I know we talked about Peakon for understanding and collecting data, but is there something else that you use to facilitate a cohesive team?
I can speak to my team specifically. Again, it's really about creating a space that is very psychologically safe for people, right? What am I doing consciously every day to create a space where people feel free and open to share? That as a leader, that is my responsibility. That is my job, to create the conditions for belonging. And while it does probably feel for some people like, wow, that's a lot of weight to put on a leader's shoulders. I think that is part of the job, right? To ensure that we're creating, again, an environment and the conditions so that people can be their best selves and they can contribute at high rates at the organization equitably across your team. That is important.
Thank you very much. I would love to ask you so many more questions, but we don't have any more time. Thank you for taking the time. Such an honor to have you here today with us and sharing a lot of great insight and knowledge. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Abdi. Have a good day.
You too.